I want to say hello and welcome to this, which is the second of the edition of the fall webinar series sponsored by CROWE, the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. My name is Noah Williams. I'm the director of CROWE, which is an economic and policy center, which I started in 2017 here in the econ department at UW-Madison. Our focus of the center is on state level economic activity and economic policy. And because of the crucial influence of Wisconsin on the 2016 election and the role it's played in particular in 2020 as well, this webinar series is looking at economic issues leading up to the election. So we're expanding out a little bit from our normal state level focus to tackle more national policy questions. Last week, we had kind of a broad overview of some of the economic issues. This week, we'll be delving into more detail on fiscal policy, and we'll be talking with Brian Reidl of the Manhattan Institute, who's also a UW economics graduate, about fiscal policy in the US in 2020 and beyond. Before I get going and introduce Brian, I want to just give a couple of advertisements. The webinar series will continue next week with Casey Mulligan of the University of Chicago, who also served as the chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration. And he'll be talking about economic policy during the Trump administration. And then following up on that, which this is an update to the schedule on October 21st. So again, it's next Tuesday and then the following Wednesday. Will be Alan Blinder, who will be talking about the economy in 2020 and prospects for Biden administration. So Alan Blinder is at Princeton and was the former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, as well as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Clinton administration. Again, for further updates on that, as well as all of our work, I encourage people to check out our website, crowe.wisc.edu. The ground rules for tonight, we're going to start with a moderated discussion, Brian and myself. And then if you have questions along the way, we ask you to just type them in on the chat and on the side, and we'll read off some of those. Some of my colleagues will compile and summarize the questions from the chat, which we'll read off to Brian during the main presentation. And then something new that we're going to try this week, which we didn't do last week, was to give a little bit more, or at least as close as we can, to face-to-face interaction, which is often missing in a virtual format like this. After the webinar is over, what we're going to do is break up the audience into smaller breakout rooms. Everybody can turn on their camera, and then we'll rotate Brian through the different breakout rooms, so we'll have a smaller audience and a chance for some more personal interaction. So anyone who's interested, bear with us after the main presentation of the webinar, and I'll give a reminder at the end as well. So that leads me to now introducing our speaker. Brian Riedl is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and his work focuses on budget, tax, and economic policy. Previously, he worked for 6 years as chief economist to Senator Rob Portman of Ohio and as staff director to the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. He also served as director of budget and spending policy for Marco Rubio's presidential campaign, where we actually spent some time together, and was the lead architect of the 10-year deficit reduction plan for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. In addition, as I mentioned at the outset, Brian is a UW-Madison economics and poli-sci alumnus, and we'll discuss as well how he went from Madison to DC and his experience in policymaking, in addition to some of the the more technical details that we're going to get into tonight. So, Brian, we're glad you could join us. We'll start with kind of the big picture. We've kind of discussed this. If you could just sort of describe in overview the fiscal situation of the US now, and what are some of the key drivers and influences on the federal budget.
Thank you so much, Professor Williams. Thank you all for logging in. I'm excited to do this. Again, I'm a 1998 UW grad, got my Wisconsin economics hat, 1998 econ. I also have my cheese head, which I keep wherever I go. So I'm glad to be talking to my people. I'm going to basically just go over my PowerPoint. I have a lot of charts that I'm going to narrate about the spending and tax trends. Let me make sure the screen share works. Okay, I have it up. Can you all see my screen? Okay, good. So what I'm going to do first is I'm basically going to show you the budget trends we're facing, where we're going, and why you should probably be pretty concerned about it. Let's start out with the basics. Right now, the deficit this year is going to hit about $3.3 trillion, which is actually historic. We've never had a deficit higher than 1.4 trillion per year. Now we're going to have 3.3 trillion. As a percent of the economy, it's about 16% of the economy will be the deficit this year. We haven't seen anything like that since the height of World War II. Essentially, half of everything government spends this year will be borrowed. We're going to collect 16% of GDP, spend 32% of GDP, and borrow that 16%. One thing you will see, however, is even when the economy supposedly recovers, we're not really out of the woods yet. We were already about to hit trillion-dollar deficits even before the pandemic hit. And even after we recover, you're looking at deficits that never drop below $1 trillion a year again. And in fact, they rise to $2 trillion towards the end of the decade. And that's again after the pandemic ends. And really, this is kind of the rosy scenario, because this is the baseline that assumes that the economy recovers, there's no more wars, there's no more big spending hikes. It also assumes that interest rates stay low. Interest rates, as you know, right now are really low. The CBO assumes that the average interest rate the government pays on its debt will average about 1.5% in the next year. That's much lower than what we've seen in recent decades. And what this chart shows you is that if interest rates return, say, to 2000s levels, the first which was about 3 or 4%, you're going to see a lot bigger deficits. And if they go to 1990s levels, which was over 6%, you could see $3 trillion deficits. So really, you're looking at a deficit of 2 to 3 trillion a year at the end of the decade, depending on whether the interest rate paid on that debt stays at 1.5% as projected or rises up closer to what we've seen in the previous decades in the 4 to 5% range. Here's the overall debt, which, the deficit is what we borrow per year. This is what the Congressional Budget Office foresees in terms of total borrowing through 2050, in terms of the entire debt as a share of the economy. You can see that we were at 106% of the economy at the height of World War II. Well, thankfully, the war ended, and the debt was able to drop all the way down to 23% of the economy. Yet, this year, we're at about 100% of the economy, and we're going to go to 195% of the economy over the next 30 years. And again, this is the rosy scenario. No new tax cuts, no new spending hikes, no pandemics, no wars, low interest rates. We're going to go up to nearly 200% of GDP. If interest rates rise, you could go up to about 250% of GDP. CBO assumes rates top out at about 4.4% 30 years from now. If they even go to 5, 6, 7%, you could see debt at well over 250% of GDP. So what's driving this debt? Why is it rising so fast, even setting aside the pandemic? Well, short answer, spending. If you look at the baseline, tax revenues have historically been about 17.3% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office says they're going to rise to 18.6% over the next 30 years. Or if we extend the 2017 tax cuts, they'll go to about 17.8. Either way, we'll be 0.5% to 1% higher than average. So what's the problem? Spending has historically been 20% of GDP. It's heading to 31% of GDP at the end of the 30-year period. Pretty remarkable. Again, and also, again, look at the spike for 2020. The 33% is pretty remarkable too. But even after that, the blue line is what's driving the deficit. And what's driving that? According to the Congressional Budget Office, Social Security and health entitlements. The spending in the red is going to become a bigger and bigger part of spending as a share of the economy. These deficits in spending, in turn, are going to cause interest payments to go up as the debt gets bigger. So really, the red and the blue are interconnected. We're going to spend more than we take in on these entitlements, so we're going to have to pay interest on the debt. So you really see the long-term problem is really a Social Security and healthcare problem. And this is the continuation of a long-term trend. If you look at the budget since 1962, you really see an era in which defense spending has really dropped from half of the budget to about 1/7. Social Security and Medicare, however, have tripled as a share of the budget. So what we've seen over the past 60 years is essentially a replacement of the national security state with the welfare state. So particularly middle-class entitlements like Social Security and Medicare are ultimately driving the issue. And if you take a look at the current trends, this is total federal spending between 2008 and 2030. Why is spending rising over the period over the last 12 years and the next 10 years? Really, what you see is defense and wars are pretty steady. Non-defense discretionary is rising slightly. You see a big spike this year for coronavirus in the purple, but again, about 90% of all the new spending, Social Security, healthcare, and interest. That's the ball game. That's why the deficit is rising more than anything. The tax cuts are part of the story. The tax cuts are about $200 billion a year if we extend them. Clearly, if we didn't cut taxes by $200 billion, the deficit would come down by $200 billion. Definitely part of the issue. But that $200 billion is not the main reason why the deficit's going to rise from $500 billion in 2015 to over $2 trillion in 2030. You got about a $1.5 trillion increase in the deficit. The tax cuts are about $200 billion of it. Something else is going on that's causing much of the other increase. What is that something? So general revenue transfers into Social Security and Medicare. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, Social Security and Medicare are not fully funded by the payroll tax and by senior premiums. In fact, for Medicare, it only funds a pretty small portion of it, less than half. The rest of the Social Security and Medicare benefits have to be subsidized each year by general revenues. Payroll taxes and premiums aren't enough. Over the next 10 years, we're going to have to transfer $10.6 trillion into Social Security and Medicare. That's going to cost a lot more than the pandemic, the 2017 tax cuts, and the big deal we had a couple of years ago to raise the discretionary spending caps for defense and other programs. The majority of the deficit will be the transfers into Social Security and Medicare. You can see this on a year-by-year basis. In 2019, we transferred $430 billion into Social Security and Medicare to pay full benefits. At the end of the decade, $1.5 trillion will have to be transferred into these programs to pay full benefits. So if you want to know why the baseline deficit after the pandemic goes from 1 trillion to 2 trillion, there's your ball game. You're going to add $1 trillion in Social Security and Medicare transfers. Other policies, though, will continue. You're still going to have that $200 billion from the tax cuts per year. You're going to have that $200 billion from raising the discretionary spending caps. And in the short term, you got that orange pandemic triangle going on. That's the 10-year numbers. we're gonna do the 30-year numbers before we kind of take a break and dive into this a little bit more. The 30-year numbers are even scarier. This is all data that the Congressional Budget Office released about 2 years ago. CBO said that over the next 30 years, we are gonna run $104 trillion in budget deficits, which is pretty amazing. That's gonna go from 20 trillion to 120 trillion. That's in nominal dollars. If you want to adjust it for inflation, cut it by about 1/3. Where's the 104 trillion going to come from? According to CBO, Social Security and Medicare systems are going to run a $101 trillion shortfall. The rest of the budget's only going to run a $3 trillion shortfall. Specifically, Social Security is going to be a $30 trillion drag on the budget, and Medicare is going to be a $70 trillion drag on the budget. Pretty remarkable. Overall, by 2050, if you just take a snapshot 30 years from now under the current baseline, Social Security and Medicare will be spending 20% of GDP and bringing in 5.8% of GDP in dedicated revenues. Now, by the way, what I'm doing in this calculation too is I'm allocating the interest on the debt for what programs are responsible. So if you include the interest on the debt that's directly attributable to Social Security and Medicare, they're going to be spending 20% and collecting 5.8. The rest of the budget is actually going to have a slight surplus. So really, if you want to figure out why we're in a long-term budget problem, the Social Security and Medicare systems are going to be running a 14% of GDP deficit by 2050. Now, in today's dollars, that would be like running about a $3 trillion deficit from just Social Security and Medicare. Just to kind of show what this looks like, you see under Social Security, you have a pretty set deficit of about 1.8, 1.9% of GDP per year. It's going to take in about 4.4% and spend about 6.3. Now, those deficits that it's going to run every year are going to have to be borrowed, which we're going to pay interest on. And if you count those interest costs, you're up to about 8.6% of GDP in spending by 2050. So you see Social Security permanent deficits. Medicare is even scarier. Medicare generally takes in about 1.4, 1.5% of GDP per year in payroll taxes and dedicated revenues. But its spending is going to rise from 3.5 to 6% of GDP. If you count the interest costs of that, you're up to 11.3% of GDP by 2050. This is the single biggest driver of the long-term deficits. A Medicare system that's going to be running a 4.6% of GDP shortfall, plus costing 4.3% of GDP in interest. To put these in nominal dollars over 30 years, essentially Social Security is going to take in 51.6 trillion and spend 73.5 trillion plus interest. What about the Social Security Trust Fund? Well, that's the green area. There's a $3 trillion Social Security Trust Fund. It doesn't actually save us any money because there's no money in it. But even if we did save the Social Security Trust Fund, that would only shrink Social Security shortfall by $3 trillion. It's not the overall main driver of our deficits. Medicare, over the next 30 years, again, is in worse shape. It's going to take in 17 trillion and spend 60 trillion. Add in 27 trillion in interest costs, and you see that 2/3 of the deficit over the next 30 years is going to be caused by Medicare. The reason these programs are in such deficit is they both have the same demographic issue. You used to have 5 workers paying the benefits for each retiree. They have 3 workers, and by 2030, you're only going to have 2 workers paying the benefits of each retiree. That means every married couple is going to support the Social Security and Medicare benefits of their very own retiree. In addition, you have rising healthcare costs in Medicare, which makes it even worse. So overall, the average couple retiring today will come out slightly ahead in Social Security and will receive triple what they paid into the Medicare system. Again, the way to look at Medicare is 74 million baby boomers receiving on average triple what they paid into the system over their lifetime equals an unaffordable burden. This is a very busy table, which I apologize for. We can put it back up later. This is the final table that we'll do during this section, which is how difficult it is to pay for Social Security and Medicare. In order to close the gap by the 2040s, if you were to raise taxes instead of cutting back spending, you would need to close a gap of about 6% of GDP by the 2040s in order to close these deficits. It is really hard to raise taxes by 6% of GDP. If you raise the payroll tax by 10 percentage points, that would get you about 3.5%. If you did a 20% VAT, which is basically a national sales tax, that'll get you about 3.5% of GDP. Doubling the 35 and 37% tax brackets all the way to 70 and 74% only gets you 1.7% of GDP. The Sanders wealth tax is about 1% of GDP. Carbon tax is about 1/2 of 1% of GDP. If you eliminated the FICA cap, if you said we're going to pay Social Security taxes on all wages all the way up, that gets you about 0.8% of GDP. So it's really hard to do this on taxes. And this is why, as a budget geek, I spend a lot of my time looking at long-term deficits and their impact, and specifically looking a lot at Social Security and Medicare. It's really hard to close the gap created by Social Security and Medicare without actually reforming Social Security and Medicare. It's really hard to raise taxes that much to do it. So to sum up where we're at, the deficit this year is bad. It's $3.3 trillion. But that's not the long-term problem. The long-term problem is that even after the pandemic ends, you still have structural deficits of about 1 trillion, rising to 2 trillion or more at the end of the decade, and much more afterwards, that are driven chiefly by the transfers into Social Security and Medicare, and to a lesser extent, things like the tax cuts and the discretionary spending increases. So our challenge is, how do we close that gap? And with that, I will stop for now. Pass it back to.
Great. Unmute myself there. Okay, no, thanks for that. Yeah, I think we want to talk a little bit about some of this background, and then we'll get into, some of the proposals going forward. But kind of the first question I have is, to what extent does this matter right now? Again, do we see any negative consequences now? Is it only something we should be worried about in the future? I know Cochrane had some discussions about this recently, about, are we facing a debt crisis? Over what horizon? I wondered if you could give us some more background on kind of what are the consequences.
Sure.
Of this
in the short term, our first challenge is the pandemic and the recession. I think in the short term, you need to do what it takes to get us out of the pandemic and get us out of the recession, because if you end up having a longer recession, that's going to cost even more. But that doesn't mean what we're doing now is cost-free or that we should spend any more than is necessary. First off, we hear a lot of, well, interest rates are low, so who cares? Interest rates are low, so who cares? An underappreciated fact, we're not locking in low interest rates. It's not like we're buying a house with a 30-year fixed mortgage. The federal government runs mostly on short-term debt that has to roll over. That means if interest rates rise in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, even 15 years, it doesn't just rise on the borrowing we do then, it's going to rise on almost the entire debt. So even if what you're borrowing now is affordable, the debt could have huge interest costs in the future. That makes me nervous. One way of looking at it, CBO says we're facing about a $33 trillion debt in 10 years. Well, at a $33 trillion debt, every 1 percentage point in higher interest rates paid by the government costs $330 billion a year. That means 3% higher interest rates cost $1 trillion a year. The short-term effect I don't think is as great. However, a little side note on the short-term effect that's kind of interesting is the degree to which the Federal Reserve has been monetizing this. Between March and September, we borrowed about $3 trillion. Virtually none of it came from international flows. China and Japan have almost been frozen for 10 years in terms of how much of our debt they hold. They've been about frozen at about 2.2 trillion. So where did the $3 trillion come from? Well, the Federal Reserve increased its treasury holdings by 1.7 trillion. They weren't directly monetizing the debt, but they were buying other treasury bonds. So you had the Federal Reserve balance sheet really expand in terms of treasury holdings by about 1.7 trillion. The other 1.4 trillion came from domestic savings, where we had the savings rate spike from 8% to 32%. People were kind of hoarding money and hoarding their stimulus checks. The question moving forward is, if China and Japan are going to stay flat, and the Federal Reserve doesn't want to keep monetizing 60% of the borrowing because at a certain point you start to have inflation concerns, how much can we do domestically, especially if the savings rate, we expect is going to drop back down? This may be an overrated concern because we had a lot of monetization going on 10 years ago without inflation. But the question is, can we keep up that approach up long term as the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and will it eventually cause inflation? So I would answer the question by saying the first priority is still the economy, but the debt we're adding now still will matter.
Okay. So I think I want to talk about the candidate plans, but my sense is neither of them are really getting at this issue, right?
They're pouring gasoline on the fire, I think would be the way to describe this.
So before we get into that, you highlighted a few ways that it's difficult to make this up, or multiple ways, I guess, where it's difficult to make this up just purely on the revenue side. Mm-hmm. Again, it doesn't seem like maybe politically right now these are feasible, but what are some possibilities of structural reform to these programs?
It's really hard. I put out a report 2 years ago that would just attempt to stabilize the debt at 95% of GDP. Wasn't trying to balance the budget. On Social Security, really, there's 3 levers you can pull. You can raise the tax or pay the FICA tax all the way up on your income. You can raise the eligibility age, which is headed to 67 by 2030, and you can pull back upper income benefits. Those are really the only 3 levers you can pull. I think overall, what I had proposed was raising the eligibility age to 69 by 2030, start to index it for longevity. And you can start to say for the wealthier individuals, they don't need as much Social Security. Have them get a smaller replacement rate, no inflation adjustments if you're above a certain income in terms of your annual benefits. I think we can afford to pare back benefits for upper income individuals. On the Medicare side, anybody who says they have a full answer to close the Medicare gap is lying. The approaches that I support are moving to a premium support system where people would have a little more choice in the Medicare plan that they want, kind of like an exchange like the ACA. The Congressional Budget Office says that could save about 7 or 8% inefficiencies. The other approach that I support in Medicare is having wealthier seniors pay premiums that are a little higher. Now, just a refresher on Medicare, your payroll tax only funds Medicare Part A, which is hospitals. For physician and drug coverage, you don't pre-fund that. That's just a government handout. The senior pays about 25%. The government pays about 75%. And the super rich pay a little more. One of the things I say is for wealthier seniors, you can pay more than 25% of the cost of your Medicare plan, maybe 30, 35, 40, 50%. Those are the ways I get Medicare costs down. The liberal approach is more cost containment through reducing provider payments. That can work to a certain degree. It's really hard to squeeze them to the degree to solve the problem, though, especially when a lot of provider payments already paid providers not much more or sometimes less than the cost of the coverage. So there's really no easy answers.
Okay. Yeah. So before we get into some of the audience chat, why don't we go looking forward then and look at what are the proposals both by both candidates.
Sure. Okay. Okay. Can you see me?
You, but not the screen here. So.
I'm sorry. There.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. So Biden has proposed taking this large deficit we already have and adding $11 trillion in new spending over the decade. Now, Biden has been perceived as a moderate because Bernie Sanders proposed $97 trillion in new spending. Warren and Harris proposed about $40 trillion in new spending over the decade. So, I mean, heck, even $11 trillion seems moderate. But you got about $3 trillion in stimulus, $1.5 trillion in healthcare, a $2 trillion climate and infrastructure initiative, $1 trillion for Social Security, $11 trillion in new spending. On the tax side, there's about $3.7 trillion in new taxes. It's about 1.4% of GDP. So remember I said that the revenue baseline is that will go from about 17.3% of GDP to about 18.5% over 30 years. Biden would push it up to about 20% of GDP. He'd raise taxes by about $3.5 trillion. This would be the biggest tax increase since shortly after World War II. You have higher corporate taxes. You're going to start to pay the Social Security tax above $400,000. Much higher taxes on capital gains and dividends. I can go into some of these specifics a little more. What Biden has generally promised is that all $3.5 trillion of the tax hikes would be applied on those earning over $400,000. No tax hikes for those earning below $400,000. And a lot of this stuff is about as high as you can plausibly go on those individuals. If you compare Biden to previous Democratic candidates, again, it's a lot more. Kerry, Obama, and Clinton proposed about $1 to $2 trillion in new taxes and spending over the decade, and they generally tried to pay for it. Biden is proposing $11 trillion, paying for about 3.6. So that means that the deficit, which is about 15 trillion over the 13 to 15 trillion over the decade, depending on the assumptions. Biden would run about $20 trillion in deficits over the decade. Now, analyzing Trump is impossible because Trump's program is basically gibberish. It's talking points and tweets. There's really no way to analyze the Trump agenda. What we can say, however, is clearly Trump wants to expand his own tax cuts. Under current law, most of the Trump tax cuts that cost money will expire in 2025. However, if we were to extend the Trump tax cuts, it would be $12 trillion over 30 years would be the total cost. $6.8 trillion in actual revenue and about $5 trillion in interest. It's not as big as the Social Security and Medicare deficits, but it certainly makes it harder to pay for Social Security and Medicare because you're digging the hole $12 trillion deeper. So clearly there's an added cost there. On the spending side, I think you're going to get a lot of status quo with President Trump over the next 4 years. There really isn't much of a plan. It's really probably just a very large extension of the tax cuts. Just to show you how difficult it is to solve these problems, I took pretty much all of the progressive popular tax hikes and I compared that to the baseline deficit of $13 trillion over the next decade. And what I learned is just to balance the budget, you have to take pretty much every tax increase that the progressive left is proposing. 8% wealth tax, Social Security taxes on income all the way up, 70% tax rates on income, getting rid of corporate tax preferences, the 77% estate tax that Bernie Sanders wants, the carbon tax, the financial transaction tax, oil and gas. You do all of them combined, you get about 13 trillion over the decade. And I would argue you probably get less than that, because if you merge all these together, you actually start to get some weird results. You start to get marginal tax rates over 100% for instance, for certain kinds of investment. So even hypothetically, you need to do everything just to balance the budget. And that's why I get nervous when I see even big expensive proposals that are paid for in taxes. Because my reaction is, you're going to need those taxes just to deal with the underlying deficit. It's kind of like somebody who's in debt getting a bonus from working, going on vacation. Well, yes, your vacation is paid for with your bonus, but shouldn't the first priority be to pay off your debt? That's why I get pretty nervous about both President Trump and Biden. I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better.
All right. Well, that's sobering, to say the least. We've had a couple of questions come in from the chat. Again, I want to encourage anyone who has any, and again, we can branch out from the discussion we've had so far to throw those in. I don't know if Kim or Simeon have any of those questions ready.
Sure. You can go with one of them.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Simeon. Go ahead. So one of the questions was that interest rates are low now, and the question is, what's the expectations? How long do you think they're going to stay low? And I'm actually going to take the opportunity to tie it back to something that Leo Hanian talked about a week ago, which is, so his assessment was investors seem to be okay for now, but investors are very finicky, right? So they can turn on a dime. And his example was Greece was able to borrow at pretty reasonable rates. And over the course of just a few months, the rates had gone up to really high levels, 18, 20, 30%, right? In really a very short time. So, he said, and I quote or a paraphrase, we're fine for now, but there's going to be some debt to GDP ratio where someone's going to get nervous, and then it's going to unravel very quickly. So I'd be curious what your take is on that.
I think Professor Hanian is exactly where I am. Interest rates, I don't foresee interest rates rising that much in the near future, unless you see something kind of going haywire with the Federal Reserve and inflation, with the amount of money they're throwing into the economy. You might see something there that goes haywire. However, once the economy recovers, there are factors that can raise interest rates moving forward. Over time, first off, there's just inertia. Interest rates right now are much lower than they've been historically. There is little historical precedent for them staying this low, and CBO really needs them to be low. Like we need interest rates to stay below 2% for this debt to be affordable. Over time, you not only have a growing economy, which should raise interest rates, you probably have a little bit more inflation. You have a Federal Reserve that's willing to be more accommodationist on inflation. You're going to have the baby boomers drawing down their savings. You might have investment moving to emerging markets. You have all sorts of factors that can raise interest rates to at least, the 3, 4, 5% level that used to be pretty normal. Additionally, as Professor Ohanian said, it's as much market psychology in terms of a debt crisis. Something at some point can make investors nervous, whether it's the breakdown of budget talks, whether it's a certain measure like 100% of GDP debt or 150% or 170%. All you need is Wall Street getting nervous and saying the federal government does not have a plan to tackle its long-term debt. The debt to GDP ratio is rising unsustainably. We want higher interest rates to compensate for this. And of course, when they demand higher interest rates, that just costs the government even more money, which makes the debt even larger, which makes them more nervous. And that's why, like in Greece, it can grow exponentially. So When this happens, I do not know. And if I did, I could become a rich man. I could find some way to work the market. But at some point, you have normal economic inertia and a rising debt that at some point is going to psychologically have Wall Street asking questions. That could happen in 3 years. It could happen in 5 years. It could happen in 10 years. It could happen in 2 years. I wish I knew when, but I don't think you can have a debt rise to 200% of GDP while the market shrugs the whole time.
Right. So Brian, I would like to, so you've stressed as a measure, which I think is the correct one, debt to GDP. You focused a lot on debt and not much on GDP. An optimist might say, well, what you can do is grow your way out of a debt to GDP problem. As Dick Davies, the chair of the Econ Alumni Board, brought up, some people view the idea that tax cuts are going to grow the economy faster than their cost is going to be. Other people might say, actually, what we need to do is invest more. The government should be spending more on programs, and that's going to lead to higher GDP growth. Do you want to say a bit about maybe how these things might be related, or what any outlook you might have on that kind of an idea?
Sure. I think growth is necessary but not sufficient. If the economy is stagnant, it is impossible to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. Because you have to cut more spending at a time when the economy can handle it even less. The reality is, though, growing our way out of this is really difficult. We had a huge productivity surge between 1992 and 2005 by about 1 percentage point GDP rose. Let's say we get another 1 percentage point rise moving forward. Let's say we nearly double productivity. That would reduce the 30-year deficit by about 25 or 30% as projected. And that's assuming a practically doubling of our productivity growth. You only get about 25 or 30%, except you actually might get less because some of the factors actually sabotage you. For instance, Social Security benefits are based on lifetime income. If the economy grows faster, your wages grow faster, you get more Social Security benefits at retirement. So even if the economy grows faster, the Social Security obligations grow as well. I think overall, the government has to be pro-growth here. I think you have to do what it takes, whether it's on the investment or tax side, to keep the economy humming. I do, however, think it is unrealistic to think that you're going to get the full 1.5, 2 percentage point permanent growth spike that's really even going to cut 25, 30% off the 30-year numbers, especially because countries that are growing that fast, it's usually because of labor supply is growing in population. We have 74 million boomers. Our labor supply growth is going to be shrinking, which means it almost all is going to have to come from productivity and capital. And you just don't see productivity double like we would need it to double. Growth is necessary. Do what it takes on the tax and spending side. It's not sufficient.
Yeah, I was going to ask along those lines, some of those estimates that you gave, like, do they take into account the feedback on the economy, particularly some of those progressive ones where certainly where if you add them all up, certainly the economic impact is going to be going to lessen the revenue that they could raise. Exactly.
When I try to use dynamic estimates, which take into account the economic effect, like Tax Policy Center, Penn Wharton, where I could, I incorporated the macro effects. But what I was not able to do was the macro effects of doing each of these policies on top of each other. If you can raise taxes on investments somewhat without a big economic negative, but if you're raising taxes largely on economic investment and capital gains, and then slapping a wealth tax on it, and then slapping an estate tax on the same income when the person dies, you start to have overall income rates that shoot up over 100%. You're not going to raise that much money when you do tax on top of tax on top of tax. So even the 13 trillion that I showed, I was being very generous.
Okay, Noah, if we have time, I'll ask one more question from the audience. My take, one of the takeaways I think from what you've shown us is that healthcare seems to be probably the biggest driver of all of this, and that So I guess there's two pieces to this. There's the demographics, which are temporary, but there's the cost, the rise in cost, which seems, as of now, to sort of keep going. Given that we're at a point right now where lots of people are talking about we should be expanding how much healthcare the government is providing to everybody, would you put some of this into context? I know you touched on it already a litof bit about trying to control costs and ways to do it. There seems to be a very large push towards more healthcare. Is there a way to, kind of make everybody happy here that might come from some kinds of structural reform, or maybe just tell us a bit about what you know about this subject?
Washington doesn't have a lot of very good ideas in terms of bending the health cost curve backwards. They really don't. We have had a little bit of success over the past 15 years, slightly reducing the growth of healthcare costs in Washington, which may surprise some people. A lot of it actually comes from Medicare Part D in 2003, having some reforms that caused drug costs to actually grow more slowly than anticipated. That's been a factor. Another factor that's helped a little bit, sadly, was the recession a decade ago slowed the growth of healthcare costs because people at lower incomes started to forego healthcare a little bit, and that slowed some of the costs. That's not really the way you want to slow the growth of healthcare costs, people foregoing in a poor economy. Washington doesn't have a lot of answers in terms of how to bend the government spending curve backwards. One popular idea right now is Medicare for all. The challenge is Medicare for all really doesn't reduce national health expenditures very much, in fact, if at all. It clearly is what you would essentially do with Medicare for all is you would take about $30 trillion over 10 years that's currently spent by the private sector and state and local governments on healthcare, and you'd move it over to the government ledger. You just basically just transfer it from one part of the economy, private, to the government. Now, the first challenge is how to pay for that, because what you have to do is you have to take the $30 trillion that was already being spent on premiums and out-of-pockets and co-pays and convert that into a government tax. No one's come up with how to do that. There is no $30 trillion tax that's in existence that anyone has designed that would actually capture all the money that we're currently spending on premiums and co-pays and all of that. The second challenge is I'm not sure it would reduce national health expenditures. According to the Urban Institute, we're set to spend $52 trillion on healthcare over the next decade as an economy. And what they have said is that under a typical Medicare for all plan, you can save maybe $6 or $7 trillion in efficiencies, administrative savings, lower doctor and medical reimbursements, but you're going to spend $7 trillion more in higher benefits for people. You're going to bring new people into healthcare who don't already have it. You're going to make it, according to a lot of plans, free at the point of service, no co-pays, no premiums. So what happens is under most plans is people will consume $7 trillion more in healthcare. So ultimately, the effect of national health spending is ambiguous. You may be saving $7 trillion in administrative costs and efficiencies, but you're providing $7 trillion in additional healthcare. You're right back where you are. And additionally, again, you still have to figure out how to technically make that transfer from the private sector to the government that no one's really figured out how to do. We say, well, other countries have done this. Other countries nationalized their healthcare 50 years ago when it was a small part of the economy. They didn't wait until it grew to 20% of GDP and then nationalized it. No one's really done what we're trying to do. Healthcare, if anyone on this call has a solution on healthcare, you're gonna be rich and famous someday, because there really isn't a great solution right now. And I wish we had more economists working on this.
I had one more question about going forward. I wanted to think about, so you mentioned the Biden plan. Well, so I guess first off, presume for the sake of argument that there is a Democratic Senate. How much of the Biden plan would you foresee actually getting enacted? What would be the major new spending initiatives? And then also, one thing I've written on is, as you mentioned, Biden doesn't raise direct taxes on anyone under 400,000,
Yes.
but some of the additional impacts. So if you could touch on each of those, and then we want to talk.
Sure. I think what you will get with Biden actually bears a lot of resemblance to what we got with Obama in 2009 when he took over with the Democratic Congress during a recession. I think if the Democrats take Congress, you're probably going to get a lot of stimulus spending, $2-3 trillion. They will be able to do that probably through reconciliation, which you can do with only 50 senators, much like what you had in 2009. You're going to get $2-3 trillion. After that, realistically, I think the biggest push on the left is going to be in healthcare. Biden has talked a lot about expanding Obamacare, bringing in a public option, lowering the Medicare age. That strikes me as a second year kind of project is a more modest healthcare expansion, $1 trillion, $2 trillion. That's the kind of thing that they can probably pay for with some of the low hanging fruit on the tax side, such as repealing a lot of the 2017 tax cuts for upper income individuals, raising the corporate rate, which was cut from 35 to 21% up to about 28%, hitting some of the taxes on the rich. There's probably enough there that they could pass that would pay for about a $1.5 trillion health expansion. I think you're probably going to get that. I don't think you're going to see the support on the Democratic side for a lot of the other big things like a $1 trillion Social Security expansion. I'm not sure you're going to get trillions in climate spending or anything like that, or a huge expansion of the safety net. I'm just not sure the votes are there or the taxes to pay for it are there. Noah, you brought up also a good point. Biden has said he's not going to raise direct tax. He's not going to raise taxes on those earning under 400,000. But that doesn't mean you're not going to pay any price if you're earning under 400,000. For instance, if you raise the corporate tax from 21% to 28%, or really you raise any sort of corporate taxes, who's ever paying the tax isn't necessarily the person bearing the burden. The corporate tax in many ways is passed on to workers through lower wages. It's passed on to consumers through higher prices. It's passed on to your 401k through lower returns. And what a lot of analyses have shown, such as the Tax Policy Center, which is the Brookings Institution and the Urban Institute, is that families earning under 400,000 will, could pay, as much as $500,000 a year even in overall costs of lower wages, smaller 401k, and higher prices in terms of the burden from these taxes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I just want to mention as well that a lot of the taxes on wealthy people hit pass-through businesses, right? Which would have the same effect.
Exactly.
So we want to step back a little bit. You mentioned at the outset, or I guess I alluded to it, and you put on your cap there. I want to talk a little bit about your days at UW. So you were econ and poli-sci student.
Econ, poli-sci, double major, class of '98.
Okay. I know we were chatting at the outset that there's been a lot of turnover since then, but who was your favorite professor in econ back in those days, or who had the biggest impact?
Professor Donald Hester taught money and banking, economics 330. He was really good. The reason I liked him so much is he was really passionate. I mean, you could see he lived the stuff, and he was really good. Jim Andreoni taught public finance 441. That was very good. Linda Varga taught intermediate macro 302. She was very good. I could say I had a great experience. In fact, when I ended up going to graduate school for public policy, I felt really far ahead of a lot of my classmates in public policy because I had a really great education in econ at UW.
So did you go from UW straight out to DC, or I guess maybe talk a little bit about how you ended up in DC and got involved in politics?
Sure. Well, while I was at UW, I wrote for the Badger Herald. I was chairman of the College Republicans. Don't hate me. Hate me. And most importantly, I interned at the Capitol. Governor Tommy Thompson was the governor at the time, and I interned as a policy analyst, and I really learned a lot about the day-to-day running of government. So after I graduated, I spent a year working on a congressional campaign up in Green Bay for Mark Green. Won. Went back to working for the governor, and then went and got my master's degree. I got a master's in public policy from Princeton at the Woodrow Wilson School. So I took 1 year off, to work in campaigns and government, got my master's at Princeton, and then I went to Washington. And I really had not worked in Washington before. In fact, I was planning on going back and working in state government, but there was a hiring freeze at the state capitol. I had only done an internship in Washington, but the key for me, like, if you want to work in Washington, I think first, it really helps to get a master's degree. I think you're a lot more employable with a master's degree. It helps to intern both in state government and Washington, just to get that feel for how government works and what your role can be. And then I think it really helps to have good writing samples. And I learned really good writing at UW. I wrote a 100-page master's thesis. You need to be able to write both kind of short teaching op-ed kind of things that explain policy and longer policy analysis. If you can send really good writing samples, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of context if you're going to say the think tank route. But if you have really good writing samples and you worked in government and you got a good GPA and you've interned, you can go far. If you want to work on the Hill, it's a little more challenging in that usually they want you to kind of have some connection to the district. That's a little harder. But if you want to go the think tank route, writing samples, internships, and a good academic record really help you.
Okay, no, that's great. So you've been in DC a long time and been both in the think tank world and on the Hill. So what is kind of, for an outside observer, like what is something, you know, that's kind of misunderstood about how the policy process works?
I would say we get along. You know, if you look at Twitter, it's a war. You know, and all the policy people, you know, it's really easy. Like if you go to Twitter, and I have to be on it for my job, and it's a hellhole. You have left and right despising each other. In the policy community in Washington, the left and right work together pretty well. When I was at the Heritage Foundation for 10 years, I would do breakfasts and lunch with liberal think tankers, Brookings, Urban, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We had working groups, we co-wrote papers. When we disagreed vigorously but respectfully. And I think one thing people don't understand is how much respect there is among the analysts. And that's also why I get a little frustrated on social media when people say everything the left think tank says is a lie, or everything the right think tank says is a lie. Actually, if you talk to the think tank people, we get along pretty well, and there's actually a lot more common ground than you think. On the Hill, I would say too, there's better relationships than you would think on the Hill, especially among staff. A lot of the screaming is theater. If you get the members, I've been on commissions with members negotiating, senators and congressmen negotiating in the room privately major legislation. And when the cameras are off, there's a lot more respect and collegiality than you would think. It's when the cameras are on, they feel this need to perform. And I find that really frustrating. There's a lot more respect. And I will say a lot of the people that you see on social media screaming the loudest are the people who have the least actual influence on the Hill. There's a lot more respect and collegiality than one would think behind the scenes.
Well, I guess since we started on a gloomy note, I think it's nice to end on an up note there. I do want to mention we'll be stopping the recording shortly. And for people who are interested in sticking around, we're going to go into breakout rooms, and then we're going to rotate Brian through the breakout room. So we'll have smaller audiences. People can turn on their cameras and audio and have some direct interaction that way. Again, doing what we can in these days to have some personal interaction. So he'll be rotating through the breakout room. So if he's not in yours at the outset, you know, stay with us, talk amongst yourselves, and we'll be joining you then. So again, thank you for everyone for tuning in, asking questions. Hope this was informative. And again, we'll be meeting again next Tuesday with Casey Mulligan. All right, so now we'll split up. Stop the recording.